So, welcome everyone to the third session of the New Voices talk series on women in the history of analytic philosophy and philosophy of science, which I am co-organizing with Dr. Michele Vagnetti. Today's talk is by Dr. Giulia Felappi. Dr. Felappi completed her PhD at King College London in 2015, where she also held an analysis trust studentship. In 2016, she joined the Department of Philosophy at Southampton. Before moving to the UK, she studied in Milan and Pisa, while also being a visiting student at Oxford and NYU. She works primarily on the intersection between philosophy of language and metaphysics. The aim of her research is to understand the relationship between three fundamental kinds of entities: objects in the world, thoughts about those objects, and language about objects and thoughts. In particular, she focuses on the nature of contents, propositions, and facts, and many of her publications aim at showing that there are no propositions. She's also very interested in the history of early analytic philosophy, and in particular in the theories of contents and facts of some female figures, such as Dorothy Rinch and Susan Langer. Her talk today is about another important figure in the history of early analytic philosophy. Well, actually, not that early. uh, uh, Margaret MacDonald, and the talk is titled "There is no reason for the necessity of the ultimate principles of deduction." Margaret MacDonald on the necessity of logic. Okay, so let's begin Julia's talk. The floor is yours, Julia.
Thanks so much, Andreas, and thanks, Michele, also for having me. So I'm particularly grateful because I only started reading properly Margaret MacDonald a couple of years ago. So this is truly work in progress. And it's good to get some feedback on this piece. So Margaret MacDonald, as you might know, is behind the famous Brown and Blue books by Wittgenstein. And so she attended Wittgenstein lectures. She was a student of Susan Stebbing. So the talk I will present today will not be about her influences. They will be very clear to all of you who know Wittgenstein and Stebbing, but I will not talk about them directly. I will just talk about exactly what Margaret MacDonald says about the topic of the necessity of logic. So if you are curious about the relationship, you can maybe ask me later. But I just want to present a view and show you why I think that is a view that is meaningful today as well, despite all the developments that occurred in logic since her time. So in order to start on her views on the necessity of logic, possibly with her, we might want to distinguish three different kinds of necessities. This is standard today, but it wasn't that standard then. And in 1937, she distinguished among, on the one hand, physical and metaphysical necessity, and then on the other hand, the necessity of analytic propositions and the necessity of the principles of deductions. And what my talk is about is a discussion of the necessity of the principle of deduction. But as we will see, her views are contrasting the necessity of those principles with respect to the necessity of metaphysical necessity on the one hand and analytic propositions on the other. So what does she say? Does she say generally about these three forms of necessities? So you have a bunch of quotes on the handout. This is all her because necessities occur in various of her publications from the 1930s to the 1940s. And the first kind of necessity she considers is what nowadays we would call physical or metaphysical necessity. We can group them together for the purpose of this talk. So one example she provides of this kind of necessity is that it is impossible for the offspring of dogs to be other than dogs. And concerning this kind of necessity, that it cannot be the case that the offspring of a dog is not a dog, she says, what is the ground? Why do we have this as necessary? She says that the ground for the necessity of this is what is physically and as a matter of fact the case. Now, you might think that the fact that all offsprings of dogs are dogs, this would be what happens to be the case, is not a sufficient ground for the metaphysical necessity of that. But what is important for our purposes is to see that for MacDonald, metaphysical and physical necessities are indeed grounded in some facts. The second kind of necessity is what she doesn't really label as analytic propositions, but we can label them, label that as the necessity of analytic propositions. And one example that she uses is orange is between lemon and crimson. So in the case of a claim like this one, we have that the claim is necessary, but she says is not absolute necessity. It is necessity after a linguistic choice has been made. So it's not necessary, it is necessary within the language and its rules. And what is the ground of the necessity of something like oranges between lemon and crimson? The ground, she says, is in the definition or follow from the definitions of the words occurring in the sentence. So what is the idea here? The idea is that within the linguistic community, we decided to use the word orange in a certain way. A linguistic choice was made. Given how we decided to use orange between lemon and crimson, then it is necessary that orange is between lemon and crimson. But it's not that things could not have gone otherwise in terms of the choice. So the necessity only comes within the linguistic choices that have been made after these linguistic choices. And in one of the earliest papers on necessity she wrote, she says this quite explicitly. You have it on the handout. Practically everybody will give two strawberries the same color name and strawberries and their leaves different color names. But we might equally well have defined same in color in such a way that strawberries and their leaves would always be given the same color name. There is no reason why we should not, but in fact, we do not. There are many possibilities of which we do make use of one, though we might use others. So there are linguistic choices that we make. These linguistic choices are typically based on what is convenient. It is, she says, more convenient to classify strawberries together than to classify strawberries and their leaves together when it comes to colors. And we then went for that option. We could have done things otherwise. We didn't. We went for that option. When that option is settled, then within that linguistic practice, it is necessary that orange is between lemon and crimson. So we have metaphysical and physical necessity that is based on some facts. Then we have the necessity after the linguistic choice of analytic propositions that is based on the definition of the word after linguistic choice has been made. And now comes the topic of this talk, so the third kind of necessity, so the necessity of what she calls the ultimate principles of deduction. So in the paper where she mainly discusses the necessity of logic, This is what she says. Again, you have it on your handout. Suppose I'm asked, why do you believe that this man is incompetent? I might reply, I believe it because it is a valid syllogistic conclusion from true premises. But support and further ask, why should this be a good reason for accepting it? Why is it a valid argument? I might reply by giving the principle of the syllogism. I could say, because it is of the form, if P implies Q and Q implies R, then P implies R. This would be considered adequate by most people. But suppose my inquirer is a philosopher and goes on, and why do you accept the principle of the syllogism as necessarily true? I might try to deduce this principle from more primitive logical principles and perhaps ultimately from the principle of contradiction. So what she is saying here is the following. Take an instance of a logical principle, a concrete sentence about things around us that happens to be an instance of a logical principle. Why is it that that instance is necessary? Well, I can argue, she says, that it is necessary exactly because it is an instance of a principle of deduction. Then suppose that my inquirer asks, well, but what about the principles of deduction themselves? Why are they necessary? Well, she says, for some principles, we might say that they are necessary because they can be deduced from other more basic logical principles. But then you see at the end of the quotation, ultimately, we go to the principle of contradiction. So according to MacDonald, we have some principles that are ultimate principle of this deduction. They are the most basic principles of deduction. And of course, in the case of those, we cannot say that their necessity comes from being derivable from other principles. So in the paper, she's not completely explicit about that, but what she does is to say, well, there is an easier case concerning the necessity of logic. That is the case of instances of principles or the case of some principles that are derivative from other principles of deduction. The hard case is the one of basic principles, and their go-to example is the principle of non-contradiction, or the law of non-contradiction, or in fact, as she calls it, the principle of contradiction. And then she says, this is the real problem for us, because of course it is necessary, but the inquirer would continue, suppose that it were asked, and why do you accept the principle of contradiction? Why is it logically necessary? And this is exactly what MacDonald focuses on in the 1940 paper, and what she focuses on also in other papers. So what I will do in the rest of this paper is to show you what she thinks the ground of the necessity of the ultimate principle of logic, case in point, principle of non-contradiction, is not. She thinks that we cannot take the ground to be in some facts for reasons that we will see in a second. So logical necessity is different from both metaphysical and physical necessity. She also thinks that the ground cannot be us, either because of a choice we made concerning language, so that logical necessity cannot be the same kind of necessity as the one of our orange between lemon and crimson example. Neither it could be grounded in us in the sense of a choice we made, nor can it be grounded in the way our mind are wired. So it's not that because of the way we reason, then the logical principles are necessary. Having shown you what she thinks the ground cannot be, I will then show you what she thinks the ground of the logical necessity is. And the ground will, her view will make it clear, I think, why she thinks that it is in the end completely irrational to ask for a reason why the principle of non-contradiction or any other ultimate principle could be necessary. And then, as I was saying, I will close by showing you how her view is a bit different from other views in the vicinity that might be more known today. Good. So let's start from what the ground cannot be, according to MacDonald. So first, she thinks that the ground of the logical necessity of the ultimate principle of deduction cannot be some facts. And she has arguments against what she called the realistic or ontological view of logic. So she thinks that we cannot ground the necessity of logic. I will just say logic from now on, but you should take that to be the ultimate principles. She thinks that we cannot take the necessity of logic to be grounded in some facts for a number of reasons, but two are, I think, what she takes to be the most fatal objections. So we'll just show you them. So the first is what nowadays usually goes under the label of the access worry. It is an epistemological problem. So she thinks that if there were some facts that were the ground of the necessity of logic, then it would be completely mysterious how we can ever be acquainted with these facts. So we have no access to these alleged facts. Why does she think so? Well, she thinks that there could only be two means to have access, to be acquainted with these alleged facts. The first is perception, and the second is intuition. But concerning perception, she very quickly rules it out because we never bump into an alleged fact which would be able to ground the principle of non-contradiction. We might bump into facts that somehow respect the principle of non-contradiction, but we never bump into a fact that would ground the necessity of such a principle. So the only other option for her is then intuitions. So the only way to say that there are these alleged facts and that we are acquainted with them would be to say that we, thanks to the faculty of intuition, we can have access to them. But she says, and for those of you who like Stebbing, we will see here how much of a student of Stebbing she was, even though I'm no way saying that she didn't have independent arguments, but you can see some positive influence here. She says, well, what would this kind of sixth sense be? That is already quite mysterious, but the real problem for MacDonald is that in logic, we make mistakes. So then we would need a form of intuition that is capable of mistake. And then she says, these Cartesian logical intuitions would need to be mistaken, but corrigible intuition is a contradiction by any ordinary use of intuition. So if we study a bit what we try to mean by intuition, intuitions have to be error-free. But in logic, we do make mistakes, she thinks, and therefore intuition cannot do as the means via which we would get acquainted with these alleged facts, able to ground the necessity of logic. So the only two options would be perception and intuition. Neither can really be the means to be acquainted with these facts, and so she concludes we would be convicted to mysticism about these facts that would ground. And this is a theme that occurs in a number of her publications. This is a bit of my reconstruction of the argument. But I think that the point about intuition is something that she believed in for a number of years at least. As you might know, MacDonald abandoned reflections about logic. She just then moved to aesthetics. So it's not that she changed her mind, it's that she didn't touch upon these topics after 46, I would say. So the necessity of logic cannot be grounded in some facts because we have no means to have access to them. That's the first problem for her. The second problem is that she thinks that these facts would not be able to ground the necessity of logic. So the first is a bit of an epistemological worry. This one is more of a metaphysical, or what nowadays we would say a problem about grounding, the inability of something to ground something else. And what is her point about these facts being unable to ground necessity? Well, she thinks that the only way in which facts could ground the necessity of logic is the way that was put forward by Cohen in a preface to logic that she was reviewing in a short article. And she said that only way would be to say that the ultimate principle of deduction are necessary because they apply not just to the facts around us, but to all possible facts and objects. So facts would ground the necessity of logic because it would be that all facts, possible and actual, were to comply with these principles, and then that would ground the necessity of logic. But then she says, well, of course, logical principles apply to all actual and possible facts. There is no doubt about that. But this set of all possible facts cannot ground the necessity of logic for the following reason. Take this set of all the possible facts. Well, either this set is selecting by relying on the necessity of these principles. So we are using the principles to select what are all the possible facts, or this set of all the possible facts would be selected independently of logic. But then in both cases, the ground is not coming. Because if we think that the set of all possible facts is established by using logical principles, then of course we cannot employ that set to ground the necessity of logic because it would not be independent. So there would be a circle here. But on the other hand, if we were to select the set of all possible facts independently from the logical principle, then we have no reason to think that that set has anything to say about the necessity of logic. How could we select this set of all possible facts if not by relying on logic? She thinks that the only way to go is to think about what we can imagine. So the set of all possible facts would be the set of all that is conceivable, let's say, we could say today. But, she says, here is a little quote from her, there is no magic in imaginary facts, and what more are possible facts or possibilities, which makes proposition about them necessarily true, while those about actual facts contingent. So what is the idea? The idea is we cannot ground necessity in what happens to be the case. Now, it's not clear why we could ground necessity in what happens to be the case and what we happen to be able to imagine if we think that our imagination is not guided by the logical principles. But if it is guided by the logical principles, then that set cannot ground the necessity of the principle themselves because we would be in a circular explanation. So she concludes, of course, logic applies to all facts, possible, actual, necessary, but this set of facts cannot be the ground or reference of the necessity of logic. So these are the two main problems that she thinks affect the ontologic view of logic, and therefore she thinks that because of this epistemic and metaphysical worry, we should not take logic to be grounded in any fact of any sort, neither in particular facts, not in the set of all possible facts. Now, if the necessity of logic is not is not grounded in facts, then she thinks maybe we could take it to be grounded in us, in one or another of the two possible ways. So one would be to say that the necessity of logic comes out of the way in which in the linguistic community we ended up using words, and in particular logical words such as negation. The second way is, as I was telling you earlier, to think that the necessity of the logical principle could be grounded in the way in which we reason, in the way in which our minds are wired. And she thinks that neither would do. So let's check first why we cannot take the necessity of logic to be on a par with the necessity of something like orange is between lemon and crimson, so that we cannot take to be the necessity of logic to be after the linguistic choice has been made, as she would say. Well, concerning this, she has two points. One of them is about, let's say, partially about the phenomenology of us when we think about logic, and partially about a metaphysical difference between language and logic. And the second is, again, I think a point that where you can see Stebbing as a teacher sounding a bit in the background. So why is it that the principle of non-contradiction, its necessity is fundamentally different from the necessity of oranges between lemon and crimson? Well, because for oranges between lemon and crimson, this is the first problem, we made a choice. We decided to use orange in a certain way, and the choice was made out of what is convenient to us. We can imagine a different community in which other things are convenient, and we categorize the word in a different way. But in our community, given what we do, how we organize the word, what we eat, and so on, then it is convenient to, call orange those things rather than others. And she says, well, for logic, we have neither a sense that there has been a choice, nor a sense that convenience would lead us one way or the other. So this is the first problem. Nobody, she says, is ever aware of making a choice between possible alternatives in asserting a logical principle. We don't feel like we could say, well, we are using orange in this way, but we could use our orange otherwise. This is fine. But we don't feel like, she says, okay, so this is the principle of non-contradiction, but we could have used negation otherwise. This, according to her, is not what we do when we use linguistic bits that are the logical bit. Second, she says, there is no way in which when we reject an invalid argument and we rather accept a valid argument, we think that this is because it is convenient. We have a feeling that there is something about the validity of the argument that is fundamentally different from asserting, for example, a true analytic proposition. In that case, we seem that there is somehow a choice that has been made. It could have been otherwise, but when we accept an argument as valid, she says, we don't think that we are doing the same. So the phenomenology is completely different, she says. And second problem, if we were to accept that the necessity of logic was coming out of a linguistic choice, then some claims that are completely nonsensical would end up having perfect sense. And this, she thinks, cannot be. And this is the Stebbing-esque move. So why would we have some claims as meaningful while they look nonsensical? Well, take the following case. So according to this view about the ground of the necessity of the logical principle, the reason why the principle of non-contradiction, for example, is necessary is, suppose, because yesterday we decided to use negation in a way rather than another among various possibilities. So it would make sense, if this was the correct view, to say, well, yesterday it wasn't, but today it is necessary that it is not possible under the same respect for one thing and its negation to be true, or for a sentence to be true or false. But she thinks this is completely nonsensical. And she has examples from arithmetic, and she also has examples from logic, and one of them is on the handout. It would obviously be nonsense to say if P implies Q and Q implies R, then tomorrow P will imply R. But this sentence would need to make sense if the result of the necessity were a linguistic choice made tonight at midnight. But of course, it doesn't make any possible sense, and therefore she thinks the view cannot be correct. She phrases the point in a bit more of a rough way in the 1942 paper by saying the general application of the law of contradiction is an historical accident is just an absurd statement. We cannot take the logical principle to just start being necessary at a particular point in time and to be necessary just because accidentally or for whatever reason we chose them to be. So the ground cannot be some facts and cannot be our linguistic choice. So logical necessity cannot be grounded in the same way in which metaphysical necessity is grounded, nor can it be grounded in the same way in which analytic propositions, the necessity of analytic propositions is grounded. But there is another option that she considers about what the ground could not be, which could work only for logic, while it doesn't work for metaphysics or for analytic propositions. And this is a view that she attributes to Malcolm, and this is what she says about the view and her problem with it. Mr. Malcolm says that what makes the principle of double negation equivalent to affirmation a logical law, what makes the logician right in saying that it is a logical law, is the fact that nearly all educated people use double negative expression as they use affirmative ones. And this is true of all logical principles. Now, if P is based upon or justified by Q, then the assertion of Q is a good reason for the assertion of P. But does it make sense to say that any empirical proposition about the linguistic habits of the best people is a good reason for the assertion of a necessary logical principle? It is impossible to derive a necessary proposition from a contingent one. So what is she claiming here? She is saying, well, one could maintain that the ground of the logical necessity of the logical principles, of the necessity of the logical principle was what we do when we reason and what we do when we reason well. So the best people, let's say. But what happened to be the case in terms of what we do remains something contingent. And so how could we base something necessary, the necessity of the logical principles, on something that just happens to be the case? So it doesn't look like we can base the necessity of the logical principle on the way in which we happen to have our mind wired. That would only ground what we happen to take as necessary, but would not ground what is necessary. And she's not after what we might think is necessary, but she's after the necessity of the logical principles. Good. So having ruled out what she takes to be the three positive views worth discussing, she then goes into defending her positive view, which is somehow a way of dissolving the question as to why are the logical principles necessary. So in this sense, for those of you who know Wittgenstein and are Wittgenstein fan, you will see here a kind of a Wittgensteinian move, even though this is independent from Wittgenstein. So the way in which she starts putting forward a positive view is by saying we should not think of logic as just being the grammar of any natural language. There is something fundamentally different going on here. There is the grammar of English and the grammar of German and the grammar of Italian, and those are specific things. Logic is not at the same level. Logic comes before the grammar of any particular natural language. In what sense does it come before? Well, in the 1940 paper, she's maybe phrasing things in a slightly different way. By the 1946 paper, she's very explicit and she says, is before because it is what is common to all methods of general communication. And it is, in fact, what makes communication possible in the first place. So what she's saying here is that the grammatical rules of English are not making communication possible. The logical rules are at different level and come before because they are the very condition of possibility of any communication. And this is one way in which she phrases the point. The fact that no rational inference can be made in any system if P and not P are both asserted to be true at the same time is logically important. No collection of symbols which appear to permit this contradiction could ever be used in discourse or would probably be called logical. Why it is asked, this is from a different passage, this is a passage from a different paper, why it is asked, should there not be alternative logics which do not depend on the law of contradiction? Again, it is said the rule of chess or of any game might have been other than they are, and similarly there might be situation in which we should be inclined to say that P and not P are both true in the same context. So the laws of logic are capable of alternatives. So she says, well, some people might think that logic is on a par with any other rule of language. But she says, everybody knows what is meant by inventing a game and determining its rule, and that they might have been otherwise. But no one, I think, has even remotely been able to show that any language in which argument was possible, which could be used as we do use language, could contain propositions which were both true and false in the same context. A language, that is, in which the law of contradiction was not necessary. Without processes of reasoning based on logical principles, there could be no conclusion drawn even from conventions. The ultimate principle enter into any intelligent playing of a game. So, it's classic for anybody who, got engaged with Wittgenstein. She's comparing logic to playing chess. And she says, of course, the rule of chess could have been otherwise. But there is something that is the condition of possibility of any game, the playing rationally, for example. And at that stage are the principles of logic. Only if you have the principle of logic as holding then you can vary the different ways of playing a game. But in order to play a game, in order to have a game in the first place, you need to have some conditions. And when it comes to the game of language, the logical principles are those conditions that make language possible in the first place. So negation, let's say, and orange are on a very different level when it comes to the meaning they have assigned. Having a particular meaning assigned to negation is a condition of possibility of using any language in which negation occurs. For orange, we can negotiate and we can do things otherwise. So things are very, very different. And because of that, in fact, the question as to why logic is necessary dissolves. And this is the way in which she somehow closes the paper in which she's focusing on this problem. There is no reason for the necessity of the ultimate principles of deduction, as they are the reason for the necessity of conclusions drawn in accordance with them. The principle of logic, one might say, are their own justification, which is to say that they need none. Good. So to see better this final point that she's making, I thought it was a good idea to close by trying to understand what she would say today after the development of paraconsistent logic and dialethism, where they have built logics where they think we can indeed use a language where the principle of contradiction doesn't hold. So surely, if you go back to the bottom of page 3, it might have been true at her time that no one has ever remotely been able to show that any language in which argument was possible could contain propositions which both were true and false in the same context. Nowadays, it is much less clear that nobody has ever shown that. Surely, at least, it is true that people have tried to show that. So she was definitely a bit quick on that, and surely her claim might have been correct then, but cannot so easily be put forward today. But there is still something that she says that would still hold today, no matter what is going on with these paraconsistent logics. And in order to see what her point, which one of her points still holds today, we can start from a passage from Peirce, in which Peirce is defending dialechism, and Peirce says, "It is a striking fact about the law of non-contradiction that there has not been a sustained defense of it since Aristotle, at least that I am aware of. Were his arguments so good that they settled the matter? Hardly." Now, I think that the contribution by MacDonald that is still contemporary is that MacDonald would reply to Peirce that we need to distinguish a sustained defense from arguments. So the point she's making in these papers is exactly that defenders of the principle of non-contradiction will never provide arguments in its support. They might try, but that would be a flawed strategy. What defenders of the principle of non-contradiction should rather do is exactly to say that defending the principle means showing that no argument can be put forward, because any argument would need to already assume the principle of non-contradiction. If you want, there is something that resembles Aristotle elenkos here, but the way in which she phrases the point, I think, is quite peculiar, because what she says is exactly that the question about why the principle holds is misplaced. Not just that we cannot produce arguments without relying on the principle. So in the debate between Peirce and defenders of the principle, David Lewis says, well, I'm happy to be dogmatic and just to say that the principle holds. I don't think MacDonald is doing that. She's not being dogmatic. Rather, she's saying that we cannot play the game of a debate between defenders and opposers in the terms that the opposers want. They want arguments, but we should maintain that arguments cannot be produced. And therefore, we want to, our disagreement is not just about which principles hold, but what the debate about this principle could look like, because they want arguments, but we should say that we can't produce any. And this is a point that she makes at various points. You have a few quotations here, and with this we can close. The search for an explanation of the grounds of the necessity of the ultimate principle is not a genuine investigation. There is nothing more fundamental or better known by which logical necessity can be explained or interpreted. What philosophers from Plato to the positives have done, searching for an argument in support of the principles and of their necessity, she thinks is irrational and senseless. When you realize what the principles are and what they are doing for us, they are making language and reasoning possible in the first place, you realize that we cannot reason about them, we cannot discuss in language by producing argument about them, because they are already somehow there. Good, so I think I will stop here. Thank you very much.